And good morning once again. We are officially recording, and that legal requirement is about to be in the chat box for those of you that want to continue making those personal decisions. There you go. It's in the chat. Welcome once again. I see some people signing in. Yep, if you can put your organization name and travel destination on your wish list. I'm going to stop and just see if we've had any participation. Alaska, yes, that's on my list too. Portugal, Machu Picchu, highly recommend. I've had the pleasure of being to Machu Picchu. A lot of great things coming in. Italy, yes. South Korea, absolutely. If only we could just go everywhere. Ireland, yeah, my partner definitely, Scotland is on our list given some of his hereditary background. Great, thank you. Those are wonderful things for us to dream about and think about as we do our work together today. Paris, yes. Yes, yes, yes. I would go to any and all of those places. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the ideas. So we'll go ahead and move into our presentation now. I will invite you at any time. Again, I will try to watch the chat box, but it's a pretty small group and I welcome disruptions. You're not going to hurt my feelings or mess up my presentation. If you want to come off your silence and just talk to me or interrupt me, I'm absolutely 100% okay with that. And I have a couple of announcements before we get into our content today, excuse me. First and foremost, hopefully, if you've been with us for a while and you're on the distribution list, you got some emails from us recently, kind of outside of the planning grant registration. The first was our free Serve Washington virtual training schedule for 2022. So Serve Washington is probably best known for our work with AmeriCorps, but we also do a handful of other initiatives around volunteer engagement, volunteer generation, excuse me, emergency response. So we do have staff that focus on other areas, and we are starting to implement a wider free training and technical assistance where we bring in speakers that will complement all of the work that Serve Washington audiences and customers are doing. So definitely check out the 2022 calendar that was sent out. See if you want to register for any of those. Coming up right away here on March 3rd is around strengthening fund development, which I would highly encourage if you have the time. As a planning grant, that is a big part of what you will be doing to help potentially complement the cash match necessary to run an AmeriCorps program. Also, you should have received an email on February 7th for the June registration. This is required for planning grants. There is a discount code. Be sure to use that so you get your discount, as Washington has prepaid part of the cost of your attendance. This is being offered in person or virtual. In person down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I will be attending in person. We honor whatever is comfortable for folks. This is definitely a time in which you have to make those personal decisions. The virtual aspects of the training conference will be limited to keynotes and just a handful of workshops. So the in-person agenda will be a little more thorough if that plays into your decision. Just want everyone to be fully informed about that. So do look for that and let me know if you have questions about the registration process. And again, don't forget that important discount code. And actually, I am going to put a couple of links in the chat to make it easier. So the first one here is our 2022 free training calendar. Yep, I got that right. And then this second one will be for the national training or the regional training. There you go. So a couple other announcements. We had some really great questions start coming in, primarily from program staff as well as fiscal staff around January invoice packages. So just earlier in the week, your first invoice package was due so that you can start drawing down funds for this grant. And one of the questions that we saw from multiple people were around requirements and to document personnel expenses. So if you're not very familiar with federal requirements, it can be a little different than maybe some of your other grant requirements. So Thomas asked me to go ahead and make this announcement, and in the future we'll be adding this to that fiscal orientation. But it's very, very important that folks are familiar with the 2 CFR 200 Part E, which outlines the requirements for charging personnel time to federal grants. So the easiest way to do that, the most common way we see that done, is through a timesheet. And that could be an outdated practice for some organizations that don't have to do this, but this is a requirement for your federal grant. And that timesheet or documentation that you come up with really needs to be able to account for your actual time spent across all different funding sources. So if you are 100% dedicated to this planning grant, you still at the very least on the timesheet should have a column that says AmeriCorps Planning Grant and a column that says Other, just in case you find yourself spending time for some organizational roles or responsibilities unrelated to the planning grant. Most of you probably aren't 100%, so you might have multiple columns with different types of grants, and you actually have to reflect your hours spent on each of those funding sources. So no percentages of times, no estimates. What you're charging to us should be clearly in your general ledger, which would reflect what's in your periodic expense report. And Thomas is really the expert in this area, so if you continue to have questions, feel free to email your fiscal grants officer, Thomas, to continue to flush this out. But thank you for those of you that asked some good questions doing your first invoice package. And then finally, just an FYI, I am taking vacation here soon, February 23rd, and I won't be back until Monday, May 7th. This does not impact the webinar schedule. It is a traditional time in which I leave because a lot of customers are writing grant applications. So it's a bit of a quiet time while everyone's doing the hard work, and then I come back and kind of pick up where that process is at. It does impact our check-ins, and I will be going ahead and just canceling those. There really isn't even time to reschedule those given the length of time I'm out of office. So you will see some Teams cancellations just for a single occurrence during that time. With that, I think we are ready to move on into today's presentation. So we're taking a little bit of a break from our focus on program design and around planning, and we are going to talk about funding opportunities. So this is a slide that you'll see each and every time we meet. It's kind of our learning to date. Previously, we've covered AmeriCorps 101 topics. You've attended program and fiscal orientation, began locating, reviewing, and reading your AmeriCorps guidance, and are in the process of building your theory of change, logic models, and associated performance measure and data collection plans. So you'll keep doing that. Today is really more of a FYI session. Some of you will be interested more so than others, depending on when you choose to apply. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is an operational opportunity. We'll talk through some of the narratives. We'll talk about ongoing budget development. And then we'll shift just a little bit at the end to pose some questions to you around partnerships, to get you thinking and get you curious around host sites and other types of partners. And then we will be taking a break. Like I said, there will be some folks actually writing applications for operational grants. And so we're going to give that time. And some of you will just have a break to continue to work on your program design. We'll meet up next March 31st, and we will begin a lengthy series on member and site development. So that will be exciting. We will be talking about members and sites pretty much throughout April and May. I'm going to pause just a second to ask people to check that mic button to ensure that you are silenced. And I'm going to go through and silence a few folks as well. These are the questions to consider from our first few webinars, and we've gone through quite a few of them. And at the end here, like I said, you'll have a chance to kind of think through, will you have host sites and what other partners are necessary to be successful? Now, these are questions that we pose to you. There's not really a compliance standard around these, but these are definitely things that you want to dig into and could differ from program design to program design. And then as always, anytime we obtain new learning or are thinking about new things, how does this really affect the budget? And how will you obtain cash match necessary? And you're going to start building a budget. We're going to give you the tools to do that today. All right. So here we go. New information. Actually, this was introduced during orientation. So this first slide is revisiting your options, and there are a variety of options on when you may think about applying for an operational grant. And there was a lovely handout posted during your orientation. And maybe I'll just quickly show you where that is before we get too far into this. Just as a reminder, we're still all kind of getting new to where all the resources are. So here's our Serve Washington homepage, sub-grantee resources. You probably have it bookmarked, so you might not have to go this full complete way. But down here, planning grant materials. This should look familiar to folks. So right away, your curriculum and benchmarks document, and then your postings to date. And this operational grant opportunities handout is the one I want to bring to your attention. So I'm going to cover a little bit of this again, but this is really going to be something that you will probably reference quite a bit as you're making decisions around if and when you will apply for an operational grant. So let's start by covering a few definitions. The NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunities. And this is the AmeriCorps federal agency request for grant applications. Sometimes you'll see it as NOFA, Notice of Funding Availability, and I kind of switch when I say NOFA. But that's really how the federal agency opens competitions. The RFGA, or what we call the request for grant application, is Serve Washington's request for Washington state applicants. So we as the commission are really the ones always responding to the NOFO, and therefore have to open our own process to get Washington applications. You've also heard me kind of talk about two different funding pools. We have competitive and formula. Competitive funding is a national review process. It occurs in the fall. It's where we see a lot of our larger programs. It's also where we see programs that have a really solid evidence base already. Maybe they're coming to the table with a proven history or a proven intervention. And the competitive competition is nice because there's much, much more money at the national level for us to send applications forward to. The formula funding pool is the local state review and local competition. So the federal government gives each state and each U.S. territory a lump sum using a population formula, hence the word formula, that we get to distribute as we see fit. Now, it's a much, much smaller pool of dollars, so we are restricted, meaning that we tend to see more of our smaller programs. We don't spend all of our money in one place. So this is for our smaller programs, programs that are maybe really new, and programs that are building their evidence, programs that may not quite be ready to read at that national level. We at Serve Washington take the NOFO, the federal opportunity, and interpret it for Washington applicants. So even if you see a federal opportunity or you see a NOFO, flying around, you really want to pay attention to the Washington interpretation, which is the request for grant application. And just in case you're kind of curious, dollar values, as you heard me talk about the difference between competitive and formula, right now the national review has about $300 million that they distribute across the US states and territories. Whereas based on our population size, Washington's formula is only around 4 million. So while you may think you only want to compete in Washington, there are also pros to competing nationally. And we will help walk each program through what we feel is best based on your design, your timeline, your evidence, things of that nature. All right, so next on the slide is going to be our opportunities for you all, starting with, believe it or not, spring 2022. Right now, we are about to open a formula competition. And this is for programs that would be running an operational grant in the 2022 to 2023 year. So kind of fall, a lot of our programs are on a school year or a calendar year starting early 23. This would be for folks that want to go straight from a planning grant into an operational grant. Now, y'all are just starting to develop, and many of you will not be ready to dive right into this competition. That said, we always let people know you are welcome to apply, and these are conversations that we can continue to have kind of in our one-on-ones. And these are the materials I'm going to use today just as an example so you can start to get a feel of what each competition, no matter when you apply, each competition has a basic framework that we're going to review today. Then there's an opportunity this fall and next spring. And both the fall and spring competition are for the program year 23-24. It's just because that national review takes a little longer that the competitive opens earlier than the formula. This is most likely where planning grants find themselves, is a bit of a gap period between when the planning grant ends and when they actually apply for an operational grant. And that is absolutely fine. Even if you don't have a grant with us, I tend to keep relationships going. I'm open to continued calls. We see a lot of people wait to finish the planning grant period before applying operationally. And just because I had extra room on the slide, I went ahead and even threw in, a 2-year gap. You may find that you need more time to develop funds or secure funds, or it just might not be the right timing for whatever on your end with your board and all the things you have going on. So again, no expectation of when you apply. You might find that this isn't the right avenue. You might find a different national service avenue, or we might stay in a relationship for a while and see you come apply, years later, all of which we are completely open to what is going to be most successful for you, as well as what application is going to read best so that you can have the most success with the grant review committee. Okay, so like I said, today we're going to be using the materials that I have access to, which is the spring formula competition. This competition is going to open on March 1st. There will be a separate public training and technical assistant opportunity for new interested applicants on March 8th from 10 to noon. That again, it's open to the public. Even if you're not going to apply, you're welcome to attend if you're still just wanting to learn more about how these processes work. And then applications would be due by March 31st at 5 p.m. So if you think you might apply this early, take note of this. Otherwise, today you're just really here to learn and to start to get a sense for what it may look like once you do apply operationally. And I'm also going to take the time to just throw in the chat box that landing page because I will be gone. I think most of you are probably on the distribution lists for grant opportunities, but in case you are not and want to mark your calendars on March 1, this is the address where you would go to begin to see that spring opportunity. All right, so all of that aside, next we will move into just the general basics of applying for an operational grant. So this flow is going to remain pretty similar no matter when you apply. Now, the competitive process, as you heard me say a little bit earlier, does take quite a while because it has more interaction with the federal government, and that's an 8 to 9 month process. Whereas if you're applying in the spring, it's shortened to about 4 to 5 months, with both of those competitions starting their programs at the same time. So really, no matter when you apply, there is a bit of a wait time. These are not the quickest grant processes. Um, as you can see in front of you, eventually you submit a grant in eGrants. The Serve Washington Commission starts that review process, and our Board of Commissioners appointed by the governor is actually the voting body. These decisions are not being made by me or our staff. We are definitely a part of the process and help to guide and answer questions, but this is a grant review committee that will ultimately vote on applications moving forward. If your application is selected to move forward, there's most likely a state clarification process just to ensure that we have the best on paper, that we're catching things, crossing T's, dotting I's, things like that, before we actually submit our Washington state portfolio to AmeriCorps, the federal agency. And then depending on the competitive versus formula process, there is always a federal piece to that, some more intensive than others. There may be clarification by the federal agency, and awards are eventually made. Of course, before you can even think about that, there is so much that goes into preparing your application before you can submit it in eGrants. And that's where we're going to spend a little more time this morning. So this is going to be a general overview of what to look for. Again, no matter when you apply. We'll dive a little bit into narratives and the budget. You've already kind of got a sense for performance measures on previous calls, so we're going to stick to more of the framework, the narratives and the budget. It is quite paperwork heavy, so do be prepared. These genuinely look very different than need-based grants or foundation grants. These have a lot of paperwork pieces because they are going through both a state and federal process. You can imagine the additional burden and checks and balances that are in place to ensure due diligence around public funds. So again, a lot of this is review, but there's multiple components that once you start to apply, you'll see. You'll see the request for grant application from Serve Washington, which is going to be a basic overview. It will contain all of your state requirements. It will identify Washington priorities, and it will tell you what the dates and timeline for your application are, as well as the Washington review process. You may also see the federal opportunity. This is again where we are taking federal requirements and interpreting them to our state. So the NOFO helps me know what the federal priorities are, what the different thresholds are. So for example, there is a cost per MSY. That's how much you can ask for the feds. There's a living allowance designations, both minimum and maximums. There's different application components and requirements. They really drive what the narratives and logic model and additional documents are. The federal agency also supplies us with deep, in the weeds application instructions, how to work e-grants, which is not always the most fun or friendly system. It's where we have our budget instructions, and they'll even have additional things such as definition of terms and example measures and detailed instructions. So again, if you were to print out everything, it's quite a bit to review. It really is for those people that enjoy being detail oriented and are willing to sit down and read all of the documentation, make highlights, and get a feel for what is actually going to be requested in the ultimate operational application. This is the current narratives, and this hasn't changed for a handful of years. So most likely this will be stable for the upcoming near future. Theory of change and logic model, 24 points, evidence-based 20 points. So you can see right there, that's why we started with that. That's a pretty large number of points. There's a section on member experience, and then it starts to move into kind of the overall organizational background and staffing. How does the organization come into compliance and hold accountability practices? How does your organization look at a culture that values learning? And finally, what does member supervision look like? And then ultimately as well, the budget. So just a little Grant 101 highlight here is to really look at the weight of each section. So the theory of change, logic, model, and evidence is 44% of the grant. That's why we did dedicate that first webinar series to these topics and are assigning homework in these areas. The budget, interestingly enough, is also quite heavy at 25%. So we'll spend little time today on just walking you through, but it's always important that that budget be a living document and that you're revising it based on your new learning. We'll also preview member experience and member supervision because we haven't talked a lot about members yet. So I thought those are the sections I might pull out today. And then the organizational stuff does look similar to all grants. They're going to want to know about experience in staffing, management structure. How is your organization culturally responsive? Do you understand prohibited activities? How are you holding locations accountable? And does your organization use a learning process to inform decision making? So this is just an example of how each narrative has associated descriptions for reflections. So beyond those major headlines, the RFGA will give you kind of a hint on what we're looking for, what we want you to answer. In order to receive points, the reader must feel like these issues have been addressed in detail. So, for example, in front of you are the current kind of criteria or questions around member experience. So as a result of their service, are these folks becoming leaders? Are they developing leadership skills? Will they be of, will those skills be of value for future employers? Do you have a well-defined, recruitment plan? Are you recruiting from the geographic or demographic communities in which the program operates? And how will you foster an inclusive service culture? So it's really easy to look at this and say, wow, they provided all the answers. I just need to regurgitate this. I'm going to say AmeriCorps members will gain skills. AmeriCorps members will be leaders. But that is not what they're asking. They want to know based on your program design and how are you different from any other program. So what type of skills? What type of leadership qualities will you be training to? What type of trainings will they be involved in? So be sure that you're not just regurgitating what's on the screen and you're actually going deeper into answering kind of the who, what, when, where, and how. Another member section example, this is around supervision. So will members receive sufficient guidance to support their, ongoing service? Will supervisors be adequately trained and prepared to provide that and to make sure that they're following regulations? And remember, how are they doing that? Not just that they will do that, but how are they doing that? So that's just kind of a preview into what each narrative section will ask of you and how it will be laid out. I think it is important to pay attention to point values in combination with your page limits. So make sure you dedicate space accordingly. You wouldn't necessarily want to spend half of your page limits on the member sections I just showed you, because as you can see in these examples, these two sections are really only worth 10 points or 10% of the application. And that's just kind of grant writing 101, but I find not everyone has that background. So you really want to ensure that you're dedicating space also in alignment with the percentage of points. And you might be wondering why there isn't more sections on members or a higher point value for member section, given that this model really all is about not just community service, not just about meeting the need of the community, but the member experience. And we take this very, very seriously. There used to be a lot more section and a lot more points dedicated to members. However, over the years, AmeriCorps started removing some of those narratives, specifically around like member development, branding the AmeriCorps name, things like that. It was suggested that the responses were just too similar from program to program, and it didn't really differentiate applicants. These things are still really important. They're important to AmeriCorps, the federal agency, and they're important to serve Washington, but you'll get that throughout the topic trainings in the rest of the planning grant, and that will be something that is expected and monitored to and trained to as an ongoing development of your operational grant. So it's still there. We strongly believe in it. It just isn't as seen as easily in the operational grant application, just not as prominent. So that was quite a bit of information, especially if you're new to AmeriCorps in general. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions in the chat or if folks want to come off audio and ask me, um, just to reinforce that there's really no expectation. All of you are kind of in a different area of learning and a different development stages with your program design. So for some of you, I don't think it'll make a lot of sense to apply right now. And for some of you, you may be feeling ambitious or have a history with AmeriCorps, and it may be an option. But we'll talk about your individual experience and where you think you might be going more in our one-on-ones. But if there's general questions about funding opportunities or the application process, let me know, and then we'll move into the budget.
Robin, this is Don from the Northwest Straits Foundation. I'm trying to meld together both the theory of change and evidence-based with the member experience. And as I am kind of parsing it out in my head, I see that the member experience, which only gets 6 points, is actually captured in both those other aspects, because our theory of change model is that program structure that delivers that experience, right? And that our evidence-based data decision is informing. We're only going to shape a program based upon the data that informs its achievable. That those goals we set in our theory of change actually can be achieved. So I guess what I'm asking for you is that in the narrative, I see us describing member experience in both of those, because that's where theory of change and supporting data translate to what that member is going to do. And then I see member experience, that 6 points, is more like what's the structure specifically for them? How are we going to recruit them, train them, mentor them, support them? Am I thinking about that correctly?
Absolutely, absolutely. So for some of you, you've gotten some feedback to me that you have great foundational logic models, but that I can't yet see what the member activity is. And that's just part of the learning process, especially for those that are new to this. But Don brings up a really good point, having some experience with himself and his organization. You will see that member as a prominent aspect of your theory of change, of your logic model. That is where you're going to describe the interventions, the activities that the members will be doing. So absolutely 100%. We're not saving all of that for these sections. These sections build upon what may not be captured in a general logic model or theory of change program design. But yes, the application as a whole, I always tell folks, once you read it, you should be able to envision the day in the life of a AmeriCorps member and how that's different from the day in the life of an employee in that organization, and what enhancements is the AmeriCorps program bringing to those associated outputs and outcomes. So 100%, Dom, thank you for bringing that up. Any other thoughts or questions? I don't see anything in the chat. And again, some of this may be a little early, so I completely understand if folks are just kind of digesting, and this may be something that some of you have to put, in your back pocket for a little bit later and revisit when it's time. So let's talk a little bit about the application budget. There will be sufficient budget instructions and tools provided to help you. But I wanted to do some general kind of highlights and overview. So there are two types of financial arrangements when it comes to AmeriCorps grants. One is a cost reimbursement model, and one is a fixed amount model. Cost reimbursements are really assigned for most, if not all, new applicants. They include a detailed line item budget. You're reimbursed based on actual expenses, and you have to meet a certain match, and you report that match, and you're required to sustain documentation in support of that match. So this looks pretty traditional. A fixed amount grant is a bit of a unique process, and it does look different based on which federal agency is using the fixed amount concept. But for AmeriCorps, first and foremost, we expect only long-standing grantees to move to this. You do have to have a lot of autonomy and a lot of understanding. Um, if you've had successful fixed amount AmeriCorps grants in other states, we may consider proven successful history, but for most of you, you're quite a few years off for having this option. What's interesting about the fixed amount model is the budget is just solely based on the cost per MSY. You're not necessarily doing a detailed line item budget. The reimbursement is actually based on actual members enrolled and the number of hours they're serving. So enrollment and recruitment and sustainability of those members, retention is what we call it, that is very important to actually be able to draw down funds. There's not a match requirement, although there is still, necessary cash match to operate, because we know the federal funds are not enough to provide a successful overall AmeriCorps program. But I bring it to your attention just because you might see those words, or it might come across, or you might be aware of this in some other state or methodology. Today, we're really going to focus only on the cost reimbursement budget model. All of your planning grants are cost reimbursement. So you kind of know maybe what that looked like to develop, or maybe are working with your fiscal people to learn and see those invoice packages. So it's going to look familiar. All right, so if we look at a cost reimbursement budget, first and foremost, there is a match requirement, and this can be cash or in kind. However, you'll hear me talk a little bit later that the cash part is pretty important in order to really run a successful program. By statute or law, minimum grantee share is 24% for the first 3 years. So operational grants are usually awarded in a 3-year increment, with each year dependent on a single budget and success in order to get that continuation funding. So you begin years 1, 2, and 3 at 24%, and then over the next course of the operational grant periods, you will see that match continue to increase. If awarded all the way through 10 plus years, it really turns into a 50-50 match scenario. That's about the time we see people start asking for the fixed account mat model, because at that point you are documenting a lot of match. There's a lot of burden that goes into that, and that's about the time when you hit years 6, 7, 8, where people think, okay, I've got the hang of this. I might try for a fixed grant because it's just a little simpler on my fiscal staff. Now, this is random based on statute. I don't know how they came up with this. It's been in the books since, 1994, the inaugural year of AmeriCorps. And it doesn't really tell us what match you need. That is highly dependent on your program design. So you may need well over 24% in that first 3 years to really drive the model that you want to see happen. It is important to know that, again, since the inaugural year, these have always been public-private partnerships. These grants have never been intended to be kind of solely funding an AmeriCorps program, and the federal government does expect that over time, folks are leaning into fund development and gaining state and local resources to really drive the sustained program in their community. And planning grants are not part of the equation you see in front of you. So even though you currently have a 6-month grant that you're also matching at 24%, that doesn't have anything to do with year 1 of an operational. Year 1 of an operational is just that, it's year 1. So a few more highlights on the federal share. And again, this is going to take a little time to sink in. Currently, the amount that you can ask for from the federal government is $21,600 per MSY. And if you remember back to your orientation, an MSY is kind of like an FTE. So one full-time member would be one MSY. Now, we do allow, in some cases, for new programs to be funded a little bit higher at 25.2, and that is because we know new programs are still in that fund development mode and still may need a higher federal share, and then we kind of see that federal share reduce over time. So the second is kind of an example about that notion of what an MSY is and how much you can ask for from the feds. So for example, if you're thinking you might have 20 full-time members, so those are members, serving 32 to 40 hours a week, that itself is similar to an FTE, but we call it a member service year, an MSY. So 20 full-time is the same as 20 MSY. And if you multiply that 20 MSY times that base rate of 21,600, you get a maximum request from the federal government of $432,000. Now that is the maximum. You don't have to ask for that much. These things can be competitive, so you really only want to ask for what you need. And the more you get, the more your match is going to increase. So let's say instead the need and the program design for you is more looking like half-time members. Maybe those members are only serving 20 hours a week, or maybe they're serving only for 6 months. That looks a little different. Those are 0.5 MSY, so 20 half-time members would really only be 10 MSY, thus reducing the grant, as well as obviously those member costs are a little different because they're not with you full time. The flip side to that equation is what's money is going out the door. What do member costs look like? So for the current upcoming year, a full-time individual is going to receive at minimum 16,502 for a living allowance. So if you look at the difference between the 16.5 and the 21.6, There's some room for operations and overhead, but not a lot. This is actually much better than in years past. There used to not be a very large difference between the living allowance and the federal share, but there are additional member costs such as benefits and healthcare and things that you'll see that you may want to provide. It's really important to understand that the federal share um, is not going to fully cover operating costs, and it may not even fully cover member costs depending on your program design. Now, I hope in looking at this that the money isn't driving your program design. This really should come from critical thinking about that theory of change, the community need, whether or not your member roles are required for full-time or part-time. So please don't try to let the budget drive that. I know that's a lot to ask, but you really want to look at your design and then see what the federal share is and what you may need to come up with. We do hear from successful AmeriCorps programs in Washington that if they take their entire budget, the federal share and what we call like the grantee share match, and you divide that by your MSY, they often tell us that it's really more like 25 to 35,000 per MSY to operate. So on one end, you might say, well, the federal share is a new program, might be enough. But on the other end, when you start getting into different models that, really require 35,000 for each of that members, that's quite a bit of cash match to come up with. The federal share will vary by grant opportunity. So while these are the numbers that are going to go out here in about a month, if you wait until the fall or next spring, most likely these numbers go up a little bit every year, but that's also because the living allowance gets raised proportionately. So speaking of living allowance, again, looking at our AmeriCorps statute, it is very clear that the living allowance is not to be discussed or thought of as a wage. Now, that said, you are able to think about what a livable wage might be in your area, and you could base something off of that. But it's really important that we talk about these funds and these dollars as a living allowance. It's also important to remember that the living allowance cannot be paid hourly. So again, if you are thinking about minimum hourly rates in your area, there's a little differences in Washington now with the Seattle King County area. You could mathematically come up with something that's similar, but you're not actually going to pay it out by hour. So when it comes to the living allowance, pay continues uninterrupted while an individual is in service. It is not tied to the number of hours or the leave time in a pay period. So as part of your member development series, you're going to learn that you're going to set up pay periods, and those can be very similar to employee pay periods. Just for ease of organization, we usually see AmeriCorps members receive their living allowance every 2 weeks, or maybe like on the 10th or the 25th, or even once a month. We have a couple programs that do once a month. And you will develop policies on how to prorate those pay periods if, for example, service ends early or begins in the middle, or for some reason someone's going to have a 0-hour pay period. You have a little bit of flexibility, but what's most important is that you realize the living allowance should not be shifting. If the service calls for 32 hours one week and the next week it's 35, or the next week it's only 10 because they've taken a leave, you're not going to see a fluctuation in those living allowance payments. If an AmeriCorps member is quote unquote in service, that living allowance should be consistent pay period to pay period. And the living allowance was developed in support of individuals to meet basic needs. So there's a lot of different theories and philosophies on the history around the living allowance, whether it's been enough, whether it's been too little. You will probably want to consider not just what your budget can afford, but something that a lot of our programs are looking at lately is the cost of living based on like a geographical area. And I have a link here, so once this is posted, you can kind of dive into this. I'll give you an example. We have some programs right now that were offered an opportunity with the Schultz Family Foundation. And part of that opportunity, the Schultz Family Foundation said, we are going to help ensure that all of your members receive 80% of the cost of living in their area. I don't necessarily know how they chose that percentage, but it was quite more than what our programs were paying. So there was an increase for those members. And that kind of got out. And now people are very much interested in looking at, could we be using the cost of living in our area and what percentage could we get to? The request for grant application is also going to tell you the minimum and maximums. So while you have a lot of flexibilities, there is kind of the base minimum and a maximum that you can't exceed, but you can make that determination within the range of the federal allowances. And you might find that it's competitive. You might find members are looking at different programs and looking at that, or you might find that a member is just more interested in your service and willing, maybe to apply singularly to you. But we do have quite a few members that will apply to multiple programs and do look at the offerings of the living allowance and other benefits to help drive their decisions. So with that, I thought I would show you what our current portfolio is offering as far as living allowances go. And it quite varies. The top is our current and the bottom is the previous year. So right now the range is 16,000 to upwards of 30,200, with the median being around 19 and the average being around 20. The previous year, you can see there was quite a jump. And the jump is really due to both the American Rescue Plan dollars. So all AmeriCorps programs got an incentive to increase the living allowance as part of recovery efforts, as well as programs have really realized in the last few years that they have to lean into fund development, that they do have to become kind of their own advocate, and they do need to diversify their funding portfolios, seeking foundation grants, seeking local grants, seeking state grants. So this is still very low in consideration of general employment, but if any of you have a history of AmeriCorps, you might find that this is well above what members were receiving even, 3, 5 years ago. So we're working hard to make sure that our folks can actually serve and still meet some basic living allowance. A lot of them are still in shared living situations. A lot of them still may have part-time jobs. But we're working to ensure that this is a more equitable living allowance for folks. Couple of logistics to note about your application budget. Really important that you define amounts for particular use. AmeriCorps won't accept any miscellaneous line items or contingent amounts. You want to itemize each cost and present a basis for the calculations, especially when it comes to like meetings and things where there's multiple price points that go into the final estimate. So the budget template will actually have space for you to enter the overall cost, but it'll also have what we call a narrative line. It's a little line where you can put in like a definition to help explain how you came to that total cost. So I have two examples here. One, if you have a program director and you're going to charge the grant 45,000, you will need to define what that actually is in regards to their salary. So maybe this is 90% of a $50,000 salary. Similarly, when it comes to travel, we often see one large, okay, overall cost for this meeting is $24.70, but what does that really break down to? Well, it breaks down to two staff, their airfare costs, what ground transportation they're going to use, what their lodging and per diem is. So it may be that you need to work out with your fiscal folks developing these really detailed budget narratives. And please, of course, do not include any unallowable expenses. So one of the ones we see quite often is entertainment. You can have working meetings. You can have other types of ceremonies, such as graduation and things like that, but you want to make sure you're staying away from something that appears just purely entertainment face value. So these budget items do need to be necessary and reasonable beyond just allowable. We don't use fractional amounts, no pennies, no cents in our budgets. And of course, 2 CFR Part 200 outlines all of the federal budget regulations and laws and requirements. This should look a little familiar. It is the same as your planning grant, except you were not using Section 2 member costs in your planning grant. You will so in your operational grant. So Section 1 is all about program costs, personnel, benefits, travel and training for both staff and members, any equipment, and equipment is expensive equipment. So we have a supply category. Equipment, I think, has to be like over 500. So some folks don't have equipment, but definitely supplies, contract services. Eventually, you may have evaluation costs. You most likely won't in your first few years. And then there is an other cost category where you can define things such as space or utilities, something like that. Your section 2 is going to be all about your member costs, where you tell us what the living allowance is going to be, the required FICA and workers' compensation, and potentially health care. And then AmeriCorps grants do allow for indirect. So your planning grant, you did have the choice of this as well. We call that section 3, but you have to choose between the AmeriCorps fixed rate, which is I think 5.26%. If you have overall indirect cost rates from the federal government, I believe you have to use those across all of your grants. So that might be something that you lean into, as well as the federal de minimis rate is an option as well. So there's instructions for all of this in your templates, as well as a budget checklist that will help you work through these items. Before I go on to our next question break, and I do see a question in the chat I'll get to in a second. I'm never quite sure when to bring up requirements for living allowance and healthcare. You heard me talk a little bit about that. I'm gonna throw it in here today, but we will revisit member requirements and benefits during the member development portion and series. But just to kind of drop something here, the law states you only have to provide a living allowance and health care for full-time members. Okay, that's the law. Um, Practically speaking, you may want to consider that as a caution. Um, it may look more attractive financially to not provide those things for less than full-time. But there's other things to consider, such as attracting people to serve, ethical standards, being consistent. If you have a model with some full-time and some not full-time, what, members talk, what does that look like? We really want you to look at the need in your community and the program design as driving those benefits and the models, whether it's full-time or part-time, and not the budget. We have past experience where when folks are really, intent on squeezing funds and building budgets around their program design, that usually is a really difficult launch versus building your program design and then seeking the funding to fund your vision as a whole. So when this gets posted, you'll see a template as well as some other items so that you can begin to start entering information and can begin to build a budget. And then I recommend that throughout the planning grant process, that just be a real living document and that you continue to play with that every time you learn about new requirements, new incentives, new benefits, things like that. So perfect timing in the chat. We're going to pause again for another question session. What about maintenance of equipment? That's a really good question. I'd have to look at the definition of equipment, and all of these categories in the template do have a definition. I'm not sure if that would go under equipment or under other. But if you are like a construction program design, or we've had a couple of programs that have a van, dedicated to the AmeriCorps program, that would be an allowable cost if it makes sense with your program design. So sorry, I don't have a specific answer, but we can figure that out in our one-on-one, and I can do a little research. Just going to give it a few seconds while people process and maybe are typing in chat. Okay, well, we'll keep going. We're going to end today around more questions for you, and things to get you thinking, and things for you to stay curious about. I don't necessarily have the answers for you, but this is a good time to pivot back a little bit to program design as we close our call and just talk a little bit about partnerships. So we'll talk a little bit about host sites, and when I say host sites, there's different terminology that you may use, but we're really talking about whether or not the AmeriCorps members are serving directly at your organization, kind of under your roof, even if it's not one location, but within your legal applicant organization. Or are we talking about AmeriCorps members serving at a community placement, which we commonly refer to as a host site? We'll also talk just a little bit about thinking through fund development, donors, service project sites, and trainers. So host sites in particular, if you are going to be using partner sites or placing members in the community, really important that as you begin to flush this out in your program design, maybe outside of the logic model, but somewhere you also begin to think through and have a list of what roles are the host sites going to play in grant administration. Are they helping to select and recruit members? Are you doing that, together? Who's actually supervising the member, who's ultimately responsible for the member, the training of that member? How will the host site help with data and reporting and overall grant deliverables? So those are the things that we most often see legal applicants struggle with. So beginning to define those roles now, and they may change. This is all a test. You may run your program for a year or two and decide that's not working. But it is really important that host sites have some type of training and orientation on what the AmeriCorps program is, what the goals are, what are they allowed to do, and how do they see themselves? What kind of value add and what kind of buy-in are you going to get from your sites? Most do contract with the site through some type of legal contract or a memorandum of understanding. Again, that goes a long way when talking about accountability. Another thing to think through is whether you're passing through dollars or vice versa. Are you charging that host site a fee? So most commonly, if a host site is receiving an AmeriCorps member and thus the intervention and the community outcome, most oftentimes we see the legal applicant ask that host site to pay a fee for overall costs. We rarely see the legal applicant passing through dollars to the host sites. So it's not necessarily a good idea to expect your host sites to pay the living allowance or to do some of those grant. It actually puts you in a position where you become a pass-through entity and you have fiscal responsibility and fiscal monitoring and oversight that those dollars are being spent accordingly. So I have seen people want to propose this model, and I'm willing to hear that and talk about it. But just know that passing through dollars to host sites brings additional responsibility and puts you into a different federal category. Again, I think I already mentioned this, but training host sites, making sure there's like orientation for host site supervisors, ongoing drop-ins, keeping them apprised of kind of the larger goals and objectives. And then possibly, depending on your model, are those host sites ever closed? Specifically, we see programs that are operating in schools where there's spring breaks and winter breaks. And then that can either be leave time for members, or it may be that you need to develop relationship with alternative server sites that could benefit from those members during any type of site closure. In our future webinars, when we start to go through our series on member and site development, we'll always throw in and sprinkle things to think about for host sites. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone, so I try to keep it kind of minimal, and we can always investigate this more in our one-on-ones. But if we talk about recruiting members, I'll talk just a little bit about recruiting host sites. And if we talk about member service agreements, I'll talk just a little bit about ensuring that you have host site agreements. So things like that, just as a thought-provoking introduction. So when thinking about fund development, there's the cash portion or possibly the in-kind. In-kind has its pros and cons. We'll talk about cash first because that's 100% pro. Where are you getting your program income? Is your organization in a position where it's just providing all the additional income needed to run the program? Are you charging site fees, again, if you're having external partners or host sites? Or are you needing to apply for federal, state, local, private grants? So a caution around applying for another federal grant. Federal CFR, Code of Federal Regulation, does say that you, in some cases, can use federal grants to match other federal grants, but I find it to be kind of rare. You have to get the approval of the awarding federal entity in writing to use their funds as match for AmeriCorps. So it's not AmeriCorps' decision whether you apply for like an HSA grant or we see a lot of WIA or youth build things. There's quite a few other federal grant opportunities that blend well with AmeriCorps, but they do not allow their grants to actually be used as match. So most oftentimes match is coming from state, local, and private opportunities. So if we talk about more like a donor-based in-kind possibility, this can be useful. It's very important to ensure that you are properly documenting value. So in order to claim the value, someone has to be able to, at some point in time through an audit process, come on and see that you've done your due diligence and that value that you're transitioning from kind of this free in-kind service to having a cash value is actually supported by documentation. So we see some folks using site supervisor time as in-kind. That can't be an estimate. It's really asking that partner to divulge personal information on wages and salary, and that site supervisor keeping a timesheet so that you have the value of their time spent with your AmeriCorps member. We often see space, so a lot of folks have free space that they use for maybe AmeriCorps team meetings or the overall AmeriCorps members desk space, really important that that not be just some value judgment, that you have space allocation plans that can actually correspond to a dollar value. Gears, tools, supplies, those tend to be a little bit easier if you're getting, tools gifted to you. There's often an easy way to determine the value of that tool. And even something as simple as meeting refreshments. Sometimes we see, coffees donating to meetings or things like that. That doesn't add up to much, but it's usually pretty easy to document when someone's giving you the value. Trainer time, I don't have that on the list, but trainer time is another thing to easily document. If a trainer charges $450 for a 2-hour webinar, and they're doing it for free, they can easily provide you with a letter of what that would have cost you. We haven't talked a ton about service projects. You'll hear more about that coming up, but again, it does require a level of partnership. So, known part of AmeriCorps programming is our program's interest in service projects throughout the year. Service projects usually are a bit different than the day-to-day service that you're providing to the community. So some of our traditional days of service are the 9/11 Day of Remembrance and the MLK Day of Service. We often see our programs participate in that. Some other days that are popular in our program are the United Way Day of Caring, Make a Difference Day, Earth Day, sometimes Earth Month, as our conservation programs like to remind us, Veterans Day. So any day that's kind of important to you, you can determine to be a service project, and we'll go over the requirements of that. But it's nice to start thinking through as part of your partnership development, what might you do as a team outside of your day-to-day service. So common service sites are, beautification of parks or schools, helping in community gardens, maybe spending time with seniors at a senior center, having the team volunteer at a food bank to distribute food, those things that you can do as kind of a team building effort as well as a community service project and a way to get together for esprit de corps. Of course, it's important to note that service projects cannot benefit for-profit entities. So no, you're, mowing your neighborhood lawns for someone, or a for-profit, painting job wouldn't be something that we'd be looking to support. And finally, what kind of trainers are you going to use? We'll hear about, orientation for members and ongoing training. Having had a program myself, one of which had 20 members and one of which had 80 members, I found very quickly that being the only trainer was not only a drain on me, but was not providing the best service to our members to hear me over and over again. And I apologize because you all are going to experience a lot from me, as I haven't done a very good job of bringing in outside trainers for the rest of the curriculum. But it is important, I think, for both your ease and effort, as well as providing multiple voices for members to connect with. So we'll close with a few reminders on our homework and deliverables, and then we'll open it back up for questions. I think we're doing pretty good on time. So keep doing those early objectives, keep, sifting through that AmeriCorps guidance and those AmeriCorps handbooks just to become familiar with all of the Code of Federal Regulations and rules. Continue working on your theory of change and logic models. We've seen a few come in. Thank you for that. That's exciting to see people start to get some foundational work done. And now, if you do think you might apply early on in this planning grant period, you will want to familiarize yourself with the request for grant application and all the materials, and join the TTA on March 8th. Again, anyone's welcome to join, but definitely if you think you're going to apply, that's going to be very important for you all to attend. Otherwise, you may be moving past that idea of applying and thinking about applying way later. So you might be instead taking the time to start identifying your host sites or a process for host sites. Some programs do use a very formal, RFA process for their host site recruitment. Some also, do things kind of on a handshake or already have a built-in network. Start identifying strategic partners, be a little curious, think through some of the areas we talked about today, and begin to build a budget framework. So that's your homework. Now, that doesn't always translate into deliverables. We do expect a lot of this work to be done on your own time for your own success and development. But as far as deliverables goes, we are still only looking for that theory of change and logic model, and then the identified performance measure and data collection plan you're working on. And these can be draft. We'd like to see those by the end of February so that Lou and I can get some general feedback out to you. Of course, you'll continue to revise and assess these pieces, but we do want to see some early drafts so we can get you going on a good pathway and help provide any course correction if necessary. And then finally, if you're really on the fence, some of you will probably absolutely know it is not the right time for me to apply. I don't have my program design in working order yet. Some of you may be like, I've been doing this in other states. I'm going to go ahead and apply. And some of you might be in the middle. So if you want to continue to assess whether or not it's a good time to apply, we do have a handful of resources. These links will be available once posted. We have a readiness assessment. We have a flow chart of a multiple kind of navigating national service. And then we have a document that we feel is important just to get an idea of what Serve Washington AmeriCorps programs kind of are expected to and what we see as important in our state, which is really important if you are thinking about replicating a different state model. That supplemental information might be really valuable to you. I think that's enough for me. I can definitely feel it in my voice and appreciate um, this kind of lecture. Appreciate everyone tolerating, and I think everyone stayed. Didn't hear too many beeps. So what questions might you have? And I think I will stop the recording and come on video so that we can just have conversations either about today's content or any questions you might have. And if you don't have questions, you're welcome to hop off. Again, thank you for being here. I know it's a holiday weekend for some, so give our web folks a few business days to get this posted. So hopefully by mid next week, this will be up for your access. Thank you, everyone.